Welcome, everybody, to our OpenText Cybersecurity State of Code Security webinar. We're excited to have everybody here today. Just to start out, my name is Sheldon Mills. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Fortify, and I'll be sharing some stuff. Brent Jenkins is our Director of Product Marketing at Fortify, is we sharing things as well. And then Martin Hell from DeBricht, he's a security strategist and open source guru. He'll be sharing some stuff as well. So quickly, this is our agenda. This follows the report. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, this follows the key findings, the first section on AppSec maturity, implementation challenges, tool adoption, outcomes. So we encourage you to just jump in and read that as well. We're going to highlight a lot of things, but of course, it's not as much meat as the entire report. Just a little bit of background for you guys. This report is in partnership with Dark Reading. We wanted to get the pulse on how the market is currently when it comes to AppSec practices, as well as find out challenges to tool adoption and the current and upcoming investments in these areas. So in short, the state of code security. The result was a 23-question survey with multiple choice and open-ended questions specifically for development teams and AppSec professionals. So if someone selected IT executive or anything other than, AppSec director or application development lead or people working directly on application security, then they were screened out. We also had a couple more qualifying questions, such as the size of the organization's AppSec security team, right? If they didn't have any kind of AppSec team or did not do significant portions of their development in-house, they were also disqualified from participating in the survey. Okay, enough background. Let's just jump into the findings real quick. First bullet, first one. We'll dig into this one a little more in the next section, but the gist is this. Many organizations are just still working to figure out how to actually shift left. It's difficult. And implementing SAST and DAST and software composition analysis tools are still a major challenge for many, if not most, organizations. Second bullet, cloud security. 31% of organizations cite securing cloud environments as their primary concern. And 38% of organizations use hybrid methods, so a mix of on-premise and cloud-based tools for the application security deployments. And 23% of respondents invest most of their code security budget on cloud infrastructure. So literally a fourth, it's like budgets all in cloud. This one is highlighting how much maturing the AppSec space still has to go. The market perception often leads to the bleeding edge cases, right? Which is the shiny new thing. But if barely more than half, only 50%, 56% of organizations are using SAST, and only 45% have implemented dynamic analysis tools, only 37% use interactive application security testing, then there's a lot of just the basics, the bread and butter, trying to shift left still to go. APIs. API security is ranked as the #1 area where all organizations feel most vulnerable, but only 39% have a dedicated tool to test API security, right? This is the #1 area, but only 39% have a way to do it. When analyzing the data, we asked Dark Reading to filter results between enterprise and midsize and SMB to kind of break it down even more. And if you break this out and look at the results, half of large organizations have dedicated API tools, but only 31% of smaller organizations do. So larger organizations, big enough of a pain point that they're dedicated tools to address it. Fifth bullet, open source. 46% of organizations are planning to move to SCA within the next year. Open source components ranked as the second most vulnerable area, and maintaining security of the software supply chain is a somewhat bigger worry for larger organizations. But Martin's going to talk a lot more. Martin's going to talk a lot more about this space in a bit, so I'll leave that to him. He's the expert. This kind of sums up the entire report, right? The state of code security, the AppSec maturity marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint. While the majority, or about 57% of organizations, are implementing DevSecOps, almost 3 in 10 haven't yet, but are planning to in the next year. However, there's a full 14% that are not doing so and have no plans to do so within the next year. So again, lots of room for growth, and many organizations are gearing up for this transition to try and mature their AppSec programs. Okay, I have to admit that this is too busy. It's too much text for a PowerPoint, but this figure is taken directly from the report and it highlights perfectly how complex it is to shift left. So this will be on the screen for a minute. You can digest this. Let's just dissect this a little bit, really. Almost 2/3 of respondents use manual code review, 64%, and 6 in 10 use manual pen testing. This one, when we broke it out, this question to see if there's a difference between enterprise and midsize and SMB, we found that only a manual code review, the very first one, is used by smaller organizations, 65%, but all the other security practices listed were used by fewer than half of mid and SMB respondents. In fact, static application security testing was only used by 48% of midsize and SMB, but for the enterprise, the current usage of application security testing is 67%. So that 64% is that middle when you aggregate everybody. Again, this is highlighting that many organizations are just still the starting point, have a long way to go on the road to AppSec maturity. So if your organization feels like it's the only one lagging behind when it comes to AppSec, the results just show it's still a widespread issue to figure this out. It's difficult. It can't be an excuse, but it does highlight how complex code security really is. Organizations of all sizes are still lagging when it comes to DAST, dynamic analysis. 45% currently do dynamic testing, and less than 4 in 10 use MAST or IAST. Those are at 38 and 37%. That said, most organizations are looking ahead. So if you look at the respondents looking to implement software composition analysis and interactive application security testing within the next year, so you add the 6 month, within the 6 month end and within the next year, it's almost half. 46% are planning to adopt within the next year. So a lot of trying to mature, trying to catch up and do these things. This is where the rubber hits the road, right? There's a wide range of challenges facing organizations trying to shift left. The top implementation challenges that Dark Reading found were the difficulty for implementing DevSecOps within the hybrid cloud environments, open source challenges, API security and orchestration challenges, and of course, the longstanding organizational and process issues, right? In the software development lifecycle, trying to change culture is always an uphill battle. AppSec pain points. This is just one question. I had to put the whole thing in here. Which of the following are the greatest pain points when it comes to the security of your application in your organization? If you look at this question where we asked the greatest pain points, we found that no one specific security pain point listed in the survey was cited by more than 31% of respondents. And they were able to choose, pick their top 3. So no one pain point was universal, was a universal top pick for even a third of the organizations. And this is significant. We had some discussions with Dark Reading about this. And this one's interesting because there's usually a clear winner in these types of questions. And they felt strongly that this was a signal, along with this and some other answers that came through, that the market is still rapidly evolving, because the pain points just aren't universal, not even a third majority. And this supports why we see so many organizations using multiple solutions from multiple vendors and investing in so many different areas. This figure is pulled from question 18, where we asked organizations where they feel most vulnerable. Open source component ranks as the second most vulnerable area overall, but it's actually a top ranked concern for larger organizations. But open source security ranks as 4th on the list of vulnerabilities for small orgs. So generally speaking, large organizations are more concerned with the supply chain, challenges along the supply chain, right? But on an aggregate, API security is the #1 area where all organizations feel the most vulnerable. And this makes sense, seeing as APIs constitute the attack surface experiencing the most growth in the SDLC, right? Yeah, I love this stat. There are some estimates that it's losses up to 23 billion linked to API related breaches in 2022. That is just staggering. So when it comes to API testing, half of large organizations tend to have a dedicated tool to test security of their APIs, but only 31% of small organizations have a dedicated tool. And almost 3 in 10 or 39% of SMBs tend to treat APIs the same as they do web applications when it comes to their security. And then a full 18% of SMBs in mid-sized organizations do not perform security testing on APIs at all, which is kind of crazy. All right. Sorry. At the broader level, organizational culture is ranked as the second biggest challenge to implementing DevSecOps, regardless of the size, large, small. And this is our last implementation challenge we're going to highlight from the report, but it's probably the hardest. These long-standing organizational and process issues in the software development lifecycle are just hard to change, right? For instance, 45% of mid-size and SMB still use email to share vulnerabilities with developers. And it's even worse for larger organizations. It's 49%. So this is obviously not just a security issue, right? But more importantly, it represents this lack of efficiency in the process, right? So lots of room to grow here for organizations. Here's another figure that I loved from our report talking about how organizations scan for vulnerabilities in the SDLC. 62% of organizations do check and fix vulnerabilities during development. So that's great, right? This is a promising sign. The acceleration of AppSec maturity highlights that the best prepared organizations can shift left and bring in software composition analysis and dynamic code analysis into the developer toolkits, but maturity definitely varies by size, right? 59% of smaller organizations fix vulnerabilities during development versus 68% of larger organizations. So you get that 32, the aggregate of everybody. But again, it's highlighting that almost 40% aren't scanning during development, right? Not quite half, 40%. That's crazy though. So if that's you, you're not alone in trying to, the behemoth of your culture, the organization, your processes, like it's an uphill battle, but it's a marathon, not a sprint. And there's not like a clear universal path, right? The pain points vary widely, right? So I've talked too much here. I'm going to pass it over to Britt now to talk about tool adoption.
Thanks, Sheldon. So in this section, I'm going to talk about some of the findings that we found in the report around the factors influencing tool adoption. Because, as organizations attempt to overcome current and new challenges and really progress forward towards their AppSec maturity, like we've been talking about, many are taking advantage of the range of tools, the large range of tools on the market today. And also they're really starting to prioritize cloud infrastructure. But let's take a look at some of the driving factors to those decisions a little bit more from what we found in the report. So organizations across the board have similar priorities when it comes to choosing tools and investing in code security. They all prioritize accuracy and depth of vulnerability coverage, which makes sense. That was the number one factor, as well as the developer and operations tool integration. So, again, these considerations come in as the top 1 and 2, regardless of organizational size. So it's consistent. Obviously, nothing real new here with some of the current trends that the industry has been talking about for quite some time now, right? Organizations want tools that integrate into the existing developer workflows and deployment platforms rather than standalone options that could be overlooked or slow down the process. So this goes back to the idea of reducing friction across teams to make AppSec more effective by embedding security into the process. So in this regard, a third or 33% of organizations are investing the most in security solutions, and almost a quarter, 24%, in developer tools and cloud infrastructure. So if you think about that, that means over 50% of your organization's investment is around development and security. So it's really crucial that these two coexist effectively. Some of the other, oh, you go back for me real quick. Yep, I'll let you know when to move it forward. Thanks, Sheldon. Some of the other important aspects, which really come as no surprise, are language and framework coverage, which obviously if your tool doesn't scan the languages your organizations use, it's not very effective, is it? Then we have deployment options, reporting and dashboarding, ability to test the latest tech, and finally UX. One of these interesting to me here is the ability to test the latest technology being fairly low on the list. This kind of reinforces, what Sheldon was saying just a minute ago, that, while the industry as a whole, the analyst reports that you may read, the conference talks that you may listen to, they all tend to focus on these edge cases of the industry. But most are still trying to get to what we like to say at OpenText, the brilliant basics, not necessarily to the point of testing the latest and greatest. I say this because it's important to know that every organization, again, just like Sheldon mentioned, every organization's on their own journey. Every organization has their own path to maturity. And just because you aren't the quote unquote Netflix of the world doesn't mean you aren't creating effective AppSec programs. So you can go ahead and switch it now. Yep. So this was an interesting portion of the report to me as well. In general, most organizations kind of mix and match vendors and tools to manage their application security needs. So about 71% of respondents say that they use 2 to 5 point solutions, or a collection of multi-touch vendors or tools. Not terribly surprising, but this shoots up to 81% for larger organizations. Only 13% of organizations use a single solution to take care of all their needs. So again, this approach is not entirely surprising, and it's somewhat understandable, right? Considering the complex environment of organizations today, the amount of different applications from legacy to cloud native, everything in between, different teams, et cetera. Organizations would rather mix best of breed options and rely on a one size fits all solution that might not afford the coverage and depth that is the top priority for them. But the mix and match strategy does have quite a few downsides, and I think the market is beginning to feel the effects of them. Things like it's resulting in more tools to manage for an already overstretched staff, more difficulty in being able to determine that overall organizational risk, more complexity with integrations and so on. The other thing to consider really is how much the one size fits all tools have matured in recent years, most of which have a large majority of the capabilities that the point solutions do. Plus they have the additional benefits of easier reporting, enablement. There's quite a lot to list here that I won't go into. Furthermore, many of the point solutions that we see on the market just scratch the surface when it comes to our previous slides' number one factor, right? And which is accuracy and depth. These solutions fall into what we often call here as the check the box security solutions, aimed at trading the depth of the scan for that speed, to reduce the friction from developers and organizations, but really at what cost are you making that trade? If you can go to the next slide. So really, I wanted to share a few stats we pulled from this section of the report as well here. So over a third, or about 38% of organizations use hybrid methods, a mix of on-prem and cloud-based to deploy AppSec. It's encouraging that more than a third of organizations have adapted to the rapidly changing workplace and have gotten to implement hybrid methods that are more likely to capture the range of vulnerabilities in this landscape. But that said, though, most organizations are still primarily deploying AppSec either on-premise, which was at about 34%, or strictly in the cloud, which was 26%, without committing to any kind of hybrid environments. This does vary a great deal by organization size. I don't think that that's all that surprising. Almost half of larger organizations, about 49%, use hybrid methods, whereas about a third of small organizations do so. So instead, small organizations are more likely to rely on strictly cloud-based methods alone at about 35%, whereas only 15% of large organizations do so. But there's evidence that there's more organizations that are shifting their attention towards the cloud when it comes to code security. Almost a quarter, or about 23% of respondents, invest most of their code security in cloud infrastructure. It's the top category for large organizations. About 29% of them invest most of their budget there. So this really promises is a much greater shift moving forward towards hybrid models in the SDLC in the near future. Go ahead and hit the slide. Yep. So in this section, which is the outcomes and tracking, we felt this section was important to address from a high level. And again, like Sheldon mentioned, there's a lot more meat in the report itself. We're just kind of touching some of the highlights here. So we definitely encourage you to go download the report. But we felt this section was important to address because for organizations seeking to progress in their AppSec maturity, it's obviously critical to be able to track their success, their mistakes, and reflect on the results that they're finding. Next slide, please. So while our survey respondents were looking back at their AppSec experiences, there's concern about finding real vulnerabilities that they don't have time to fix. Most of them are worried about the impact of false negatives and false positives. So this attitude's much more frequent among small organizations than larger ones too. 60% of respondents say that they find too many false positives, and almost as many say they're worried about finding false negatives. So both of these concerns obviously make sense considering the increasing time pressure on security teams. And again, what we've been calling the check the box security error. With limited resources at hand, issues of friction, security teams are concerned about wasting that precious time that they have or don't have on unnecessary issues. And chasing after false positives also affects the team's remediation time for actual vulnerabilities. For larger organizations, though, finding false negatives at about 60% is less of a worry than finding more issues than they can remediate, which was at 70%. They have greater resources at their disposal, while not always too much greater, but more than small organizations. But the real factor here is they're also dealing with much higher stakes when it comes to breaches occurring. This is probably one of the reasons that fewer, about 49% of small organizations worry about finding more issues than they can remediate. With smaller teams and more responsibilities per team member, false positives and negatives are obviously an immediate headache, or more of a headache. Not to say that they aren't for large organizations. So we can look at this in a little more depth in this chart from some of our responses. So some of the previous data came from this breakdown. There's a few other questions that went into those responses as well. But we asked the question, while thinking about the security tools you use and the results you get, how do you feel of each one of these responses? So we asked about finding more issues than you can remediate, how accurate they feel their tools are, finding too many false positives, or tools not finding enough, and finally worrying about false negatives. And as you can see, some of the strongest responses were around finding too many false positives and false negatives, like I just mentioned. Interesting to note as well, though, was how almost 50% of organizations feel their tools don't find enough. So it's kind of interesting, bit of a catch-22 on the 50% saying that they find more issues than they can remediate. So it really goes back to finding that balance of issues to address for many organizations. But it's ultimately why we say it's much more beneficial for their tools to find everything than allow them to filter and prioritize what they feel is crucial to fix. And for my final slide here, before I pass it off to Martin, we get to tracking success. So most organizations track or manage the success of their AppSec program by looking at the changes in the number and types of vulnerabilities found, with about 59% giving that answer. This is obviously a great metric to track. Additionally, almost half, or 46%, track whether or not they are compliant with various regulations and requirements. So for some organizations, this might be one of the main reasons that their team gets the budget and resources they do, is because of compliance and governance. Speed metrics such as time to remediate are much larger in large organizations at 42% compared to 32% for smaller ones, which might be because it's often much more of a challenge, more difficult and slower process to remediate within large organizations. So maybe that's not all that surprising. This worry corresponds to large organizations' concern about finding more vulnerabilities than they can remediate quickly enough to keep up with the pace of development. So with that, I am going to also stop talking and pass it over to Martin.
Thank you, Brent. So I'm going to discuss here at the last section of this webinar a little bit of open source. I'm going to, as also Sheldon and Brent, give you a few numbers, but we'll also try to provide a few insights that are not only based on numbers when it comes to open source. And as probably none have missed, the open source in general, but maybe open source security and vulnerabilities in open source in particular have received a lot of attention the last, say, decade, or maybe even less than a decade. So if you go back just not too many years, then open source did not get at all as much attention as it gets nowadays. Let us start with some numbers to see why this is. So you can see that around 96% of all code bases relies on some form of open source dependencies or some form of open source libraries. And that is a lot. That is basically all of them. If you look at other surveys, you can find numbers that are similar. You can find probably 95. I have seen 97% in some survey, but it's not, you never find like 90. You never find anything below 90. You always find something really close to 100. So basically we can say that every code base out there relies to some extent on open source. And looking at the size of the code base, so when we look at how much of the code base is actually open source, then on average, we find that around 76% of the code base consists of just open source code. And this, of course, will vary between different domains. What kind of software do you have? So sometimes it's below 76, sometimes below 70, of course. Sometimes it is much higher, so it could be like 85% in some domains as well. But that is like, so basically we can say that, well, kind of generalizing this a bit, all code consists of some open source, and open source is a vast majority of that code. Also looking at another number we see here is that we have around 500 or more than 500 open source dependencies used in one single project. So if you start to code, if you have a company, you have an organization, you make a project, then you want to use open source for some specific functionality, And then it turns out that on average, you use more than 500 open source dependencies. And these are typically not the dependencies that you yourself as a developer or as an organization think are maybe useful for you to use. You make an assessment. What do we need in this development? Well, we need an open source library to handle this functionality, for example. But this is just a small part of this. So the majority of the open source dependencies that you pull in to your project will be transitive dependencies. So these are not dependencies that you yourself will pull in. These are dependencies that are pulled in by the dependencies that you are using. So maybe you are using maybe 30, 40, 50, something like that dependencies, but they themselves will include a lot of extra dependencies transitively that you basically have no control of. And in many cases, you don't even know that you included these dependencies. And this can be a little bit troublesome if you don't know that you're using them. If we go to the next slide, we see that the number of vulnerabilities that we have enumerated is in our database currently from 2022, 28,000 or more than 28,000 just that we added in 2022. So these are based on the sources that we monitor. So we monitor, of course, the most important sources like the National Vulnerability Database that is maintained by NIST. We also monitor the GitHub Advisory Database, which has a large set of open source vulnerabilities. And then there are several other language-specific databases or package manager-specific databases that we also monitor, summing up to around, in this case, almost 30,000 vulnerabilities. And looking at these vulnerabilities, not all of them will be in open source components, but looking at them in a little bit more detail, we can see that 40% out of these will be related to open source dependencies. And 40% of 28,000, that's 8,000 plus 11,200 of these. So if we just generalize it to 28,000, so 11,200 new vulnerabilities in 2022 just in open source dependencies. And now it gets a little bit more difficult because you have several thousand new vulnerabilities in open source components every year, and you also pull in dependencies transitively that you don't really have a lot of control over. So how are you going to handle this situation in the best way? Well, on the next slide, we see a framework that can be used to simplify this process. This is a framework that was introduced by Google some years ago. And if you look at the framework, it says no, prevent, and fix. So know the vulnerabilities in your software, prevent the addition of new vulnerabilities, or fix or remove vulnerabilities. This is very general. It will, of course, also, such a framework would also apply to vulnerabilities that you would have in your in-house developed code. But it's always useful to have these kinds of frameworks because you know what kind of domains do you need to focus on, and you can break down the problem a little bit before when you try to solve the problem. So when it comes to knowing your vulnerabilities, this is, if you recall a few slides ago when Brent was talking, you saw that around 60% of organizations were finding too many false positives. And around 60% of organizations were worried about false negatives. So knowing your vulnerability here means, for one, making sure that what you find is accurate. So you need to accurately monitor all the sources, and you need to accurately have an inventory of all the open source dependencies that you have in your software. And if you have an accurate inventory and an accurate database of vulnerabilities, then the goal here is, of course, to have as few false positives as possible, so you don't do assessment of vulnerabilities that you don't really have. And you also want to remove as many false negatives as possible. That is, if you're missing some vulnerability when you're assessing it, you don't even know that you have the vulnerability, then, of course, it is much more difficult to fix it. recently, knowing vulnerabilities also, if you're purchasing software, so you're not the organization developing software, if you're purchasing software instead, then having an SBOM from the supplier here is also part of knowing your vulnerabilities. So you would typically not know what vulnerabilities you have if you're purchasing software, but if you have an SBOM, like a software bill of materials, which is now becoming more and more mandatory in different domains to have, then you can also make this assessment for the software that you're purchasing, and you will know your vulnerabilities better. For preventing vulnerabilities, no, go back. Thank you. So for preventing vulnerabilities, what you need to do here in the open source domain is to make sure that when you're pulling in open source software, you are pulling in open source software that you to some extent can trust developing software. So you can trust the community to develop this open source component in a good way. And in a good way could mean so many things. It could mean, what is the community like? What is the how many are contributing? How many are allowed to merge pull requests? And how good is the documentation? And how are they handling security vulnerabilities? So all of those things you will need to assess before you pull in the open source component. And if you do this in the right way, then you have a chance to lower the future vulnerabilities that you will have in your software that are open source vulnerabilities. And if there are vulnerabilities, you're also probably in a much better position to fix these vulnerabilities. And then we come to fixing vulnerabilities or removing the vulnerabilities. And here what you want to do, typically for a software composition analysis, that will allow you to automatically do all the difficult things when it comes to fixing. So one of the difficult things, one thing that could simplify your life would, for example, be that you could get an automatic pull request to your repository that will immediately fix this vulnerability. But there are other things that can be a problem here when you want to fix the vulnerability, which we will see on the next slide. So here we have an example of a vulnerability that could introduce breaking changes. And breaking changes here means that when you are updating your component, things stop working because the components that rely on the updated component are not compatible with the new version of the component. So look at the example that we have here, where we have a vulnerable component, which is called YARG's parser, and the version that is vulnerable is 7.0.0. This YARG's parser is not the component that you pulled in yourself, but it is something that was transitively pulled in. So this was pulled in by YARG's 9.0.0, which in turn was pulled in by a library called Metro, and the version was 0.51.1 in this case. So in your software development as a developer or as an organization, you are using Metro here as a dependency, but transitively you will have a vulnerability in YARG's parser, and specifically here in the version that you are using, which is 7.0.0. The problem here is that if you are patching the vulnerable version of YARG's parser to, for example, 15.0.0, the component YARG's 9.0.0 may not be compatible with the safe version of YARG's parser. So things will stop working. And this is really out of your control because you are not the maintainer of YARG's in this case, and you are not even the maintainer of Metro. So you cannot fix this breaking change very easily. So what you want to do here is that you do not want to update directly to the safe component of YARG's parser. What you want to do is that you want to go backwards up in the tree and update the component of Metro that transitively uses the vulnerable component of YARG's parser. So what you're doing here is that you're updating Metro to 0.58.0, which will in turn automatically propagate so that YARG's that will be pulled in by the new version of Metro is now a new version of YARG's that will in turn pull in the safe version of YARG's parser. So as you can see here, there is added complexity in this problem that you maybe at the first glance will not think about that could break the changes. So what you end up with now in this situation when we have fixed this is that you in your code, you only need to make sure that you are compatible with the new version of Metro. And that is the version that you are pulling in yourself. So that is quite easy to fix in your code. And then the maintainers of Yards will make sure that they are compatible in the new version with the safe version of Yards parser. So just an example of what can happen in the open source space when you have a vulnerability, which typically will not, we will not have these kinds of complexities when you are patching weaknesses of vulnerabilities in your in-house developed code. So I am now going to hand it back to Brent, right?
Yep, I'll close this out here. Thank you, Martin. So yeah, I mean, look, we just wanted to have this webinar to give some of the results from the report. But we obviously highly encourage you to go download the report itself, because there's a lot more findings that we didn't cover, or more in-depth responses to the things that we did cover. So just as a reminder, the report is out. You can find it on our website. You should have received it in the invite to this webinar, as well as a follow-up to the thank you for joining this webinar. So there should be various ways for you to go and get this report, and we encourage you to do so. And then obviously, it wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't at least pitch our own product. So this is a kind of bird's eye view of the Fortify application security platform and offering. I mentioned in my section about, the one size fits all and the maturity that they've made over the past few years. And Fortify is probably one of the, if not the best example of that. We have our scanning technologies of SAS, DAST, and SCA, which, are all have, APIs to support IDEs, repositories, CI/CD pipelines, cloud infrastructure is more. We've got our that all roll into our overarching platform, and then leveled up from our Insight offering that is slowly rolling out to give more of the aggregation, analyzing, and reporting from a bird's eye view for organizational risk and more. We've got our Audit Assistant and Open Source Select offering that are powered by AI and ML. Professional services to help you all along the way, all supported by our industry-leading software security research and data science teams, all with the capabilities and to support the latest in modern development around web apps, APIs, mobile apps, infrastructures, code, containers, and more. So really best of breed on the market today. Next slide for me, Sheldon. And, don't take it from us, right? We like to say how amazing our Fortify product offering is, but as they say, the proof is in the pudding. Fortify is the only AppSec vendor that is a leader in all major analyst reports, 10 plus years of leadership position in the Gartner Magic Quadrant report, which is kind of the industry standard report for the AppSec industry, as well as the rights of customers' choice in the Gartner Peer Insights. So not only are the analysts saying it, but also our customers are saying it as well, along with, again, leadership in pretty much every other major analyst report that's on the market today. And I believe this is the last slide, but just encouraging everyone, if they haven't done so, to visit our Fortify Unplugged channel on YouTube. This is where we post quite a lot of videos, everything from how-to videos to demos, product capabilities. We have a little bit of thought leadership stuff, some basic 101 one-on-one material for really, high level understanding of certain aspects of application security. Again, product demos, integrations, and more. I think we have over, well, I guess, what does that say, 194 videos on the channel now. And we're constantly adding new to the library. So if you haven't done so, go check it out, subscribe. You don't want to miss it. It's awesome. I believe that's it. So with that, I want to thank everybody for their time, for taking some time out of your day to listen to us summarize this report, but we do encourage you to go find it, or not find it, it should be delivered to you in your follow-up email. And yeah, so with that, for everybody here at Fortify and Debricked and OpenText Cybersecurity, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day, wherever you may be. Thanks all.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.